We're all familiar with the main elements of protests, right? The march, the rally, the obligatory chanting.
What do we want? Toast! When do we want it? Breakfast! And at weddings.
And the all-annoying political performances. Come on, I did those like 15 years ago. It was a different time then.
We never chose to be annoying. I think we as Fridays for Future always chose to be non-violent.
We never chose to be annoying is exactly what my kids tell me every Sunday morning.
Politicians are making legislation simply as propaganda.
It is illegal to protest, but when an officer comes to you and asks if it's a protest, you say no. And then it's not illegal.
Then shouldn't we feel heartbroken for all the oil barons that Emma's protests are shortening of wealth?
I'm very sorry for everyone that is suffering from not being able to finance their next private island.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Standard Time, our talk show exploring a wide array of European matters and why Europe matters, where we can thankfully still beg to differ publicly, well, in some places more than others, but you know what I mean. I'm your host, Reka Kinga-Pop, and in each episode I'll be joined by guests from all over Europe. We release new episodes every second Thursday, so don't miss out, hit the subscribe button, and set 10 to 17 alarms so you never miss an episode. On Display Europe, you can watch the show or listen to it in a podcast format, and also don't forget to turn on the subtitles in one of the 15 languages. Sometimes governments like to cosplay the darkest periods of history, like in Poland in 2016 when the Conservative administration declared a domestic crusade against abortions and even investigated miscarriages in 2020. Fun, right? This mobilized gigantic crowds, and people took to the streets in droves, armed with signs and coat hangers to show their anger. The public's foremost tool in any political system to find an antidote for government stupidity is protest. That's right. Taking to the streets can change laws, make presidents fall, and transform the fate of a nation. Okay, stop the epic music, because it's actually not always as glorious as this sounds. Yes, sometimes it can be a nice hot soup and an expensive painting. Spectacular and saucy. But oftentimes it can actually get pretty dangerous and life-threatening. Not only among the millions who protested a repressive government at Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt in 2011, where violent clashes between security forces and protesters resulted in at least 846 people killed and over 6,000 injured. Not only at the Euromaidan protests in the Ukrainian capital Kyiv in 2014, demanding that Ukraine stop answering to Russian political pressure and instead align itself with the European Union, which resulted in 108 civilian casualties and 18 police officers dead after the government ordered authorities to attack their own people. Violence against protesters is part of the game not only in authoritarian Belarus, not just in the struggling democracies of Georgia or Moldova, but also in France, when you are trying to protest against the new pension reform and the French riot police gets hold of you. The French have a long history with student protests dating back to 1229. Yes, that's 800 years ago, 1229. When students rioted after being kicked out of a tavern on Shrove Tuesday, things spiraled out of control quite quickly, and it resulted in destruction and violence. Can you believe it? Riots, revolts, and popular movements have always been present in European history, but it's in the 1800s that they start to take on the forms that we recognize today as labor unions start to appear. They introduced collective bargaining with their employers and started to influence government decisions in the labor area. Yay! Their mass movements are the reason we have Saturdays off and the 40-hour workweek. This was an especially fraught process, starting from over 100 hours a week. But don't think it was a walk in the park. Legal changes spreading in Western Europe in the 1870s made the unionization movement stronger, and more active protest modes developed. The women's movement also gained momentum at the time, developing a whole new art of mass protests. Today, democratic countries have laws governing and regulating acceptable forms of protests, and the freedom of opinion, the freedom of association, and free speech are basic rights. However, there's a lot of variation in how these are realized or curbed across the continent. Today, I have 3 guests who live, work, and protest in wildly different circumstances, and will tell us all about it. Emma Reynolds is a climate justice activist who has worked with Climates Austria and Fridays for Future for years, organizing campaigns with international organizations for climate and biodiversity protection. Jana Sliemzina is a journalist and writer working from Kharkiv, Ukraine. They're the international editor of Gvara Media, a regional outlet that reports on the Russian-Ukrainian war and social, cultural, and political processes in the Kharkiv Oblast. And Martin Bright is the first guest we have whose work has been immortalized in a whole-ass movie. He has worked as a journalist for more than 30 years, was Home Affairs editor of The Observer and political editor of The New Statesman, and is currently working for Index on Censorship.
Hello and welcome, exceptionally violent people on the show. Let's talk about protest violence and what kind of tools people can afford themselves when they want to achieve a specific goal. And I would like to start with Emma because Fridays for Future have been in popular discourse and on the news in the past couple of years. And a recurring complaint has been that you guys are annoying. Now that strikes me as a very generational thing. Is there like a very specific choice to annoy and inconvenience people? Is that just a side effect that you live by? Or are they just mistaken and ageist?
We never chose to be annoying. I think we as Fridays for Future always chose to be nonviolent, and this is always our top priority, to not be annoying, which has never been our goal. But I think we see that we as Fridays for Future still need to be active because too little progress is being made regarding climate politics. And we can also see from research over the last few years that a lot of people are still agreeing that more climate action needs to be happening, even if it's annoying, because we need to remind everyone, every politician, every company, every government, that we still need to act faster on climate action.
We never chose to be annoying is exactly what my kids tell me every Sunday morning, but I think this might be a different case. And maybe in 30 years, I will admit to them being right in some instances, but only when they are already annoyed by their own children. Thank you so much. Martin, let's put this in a bit bigger context, because ultimately, especially historically speaking, the discourse tends to devolve in a direction where we start to debate what's still protest and what's terrorism, or what forms of protest or political statement or force can we apply.
Protest is supposed to be annoying, right? And indeed, the younger generation are supposed to annoy the older generation. The difficulty comes when simple forms of protest, perfectly legitimate forms of protest, are delegitimized by the government. Now, we're used to seeing that with authoritarian regimes, but what is new is the crackdown that's happening with non-authoritarian regimes like the UK government. So increasingly, we're seeing very, very severe sentences for protesters, particularly climate change protesters in the UK, and organisations such as mine, Index on Censorship, which has kept an eye on this kind of protest for 50 years now, are becoming increasingly concerned about this.
I think it's still the past government that introduced new legislation, but the new hasn't really done away with them.
Protest itself is becoming illegal. I mean, it sounds drastic, but that is the case. So we are seeing people being arrested for being on demonstrations. We're seeing people being stopped and searched by the British police simply for walking past a demonstration. We've got new measures which make it an offence to cause too much noise at demonstrations. It seems incredible that this is happening in the United Kingdom, but this is the case. So we're really concerned about this. And also what we're seeing is demonstrators who've been throwing soup onto artworks being arrested and getting really quite long prison sentences. So this is new for the UK, which prides itself on a spirit of free expression.
Jana, I would like to ask you, how do you feel about these more explicit forms of protest? For instance, sabotage.
I think that if sabotage helps achieve goals that activists needs to achieve that are unachievable by any other means, by peaceful protests, that sabotage is fine. And I do think that it's important sometimes to take the the right to violence from the state's hands.
Of course, you're talking about this living in a country where protest currently is illegal.
Well, under martial law in Ukraine, protests are illegal, but in Kharkiv, where I live, we still did some form of protest last, I think in 2023, against illegal construction in the park, which no one should construct anything on, especially business center. And they didn't. So it wasn't sabotage, it wasn't violent. We went on a picnic and said to everybody, it's picnic. And we went and got media coverage, and government, local authorities rolled back on it. So it is illegal to protest, but when an officer comes to you and asks if it's a protest, you say no, and then it's not illegal.
In European countries, there are very specific regulations on how you are supposed to be protesting and how you shouldn't. The example that Martin has brought up, I think, is very important, and it is happening. There is a push in a lot of countries. Spain at some point had gigantic fines for organizing protests on social media. What do we think about these legislations? Maybe, Martin, you can tell us a little bit about how this historically comes into place.
What's largely happening, and I think this is a serious concern, is that politicians are making legislation simply as propaganda. So the fact is that in certain circles, the sort of protests that Emma is involved with, we talked about it being irritating. There are culture wars, concerns about environmental protesters, and a combination of a right-wing government and a right-wing media is opposed to this kind of protest simply because it's annoying.
It always amazes me how we sort of just talk about, is protest annoying or is it not, rather than, and which is, in my opinion, a very comfortable discussion, because it leaves out the point, what are we protesting for? What are we protesting against? It's not really about what is the cause of the protest. It is more of, is it annoying or is it not? So it's really comfortable also for politicians to draw attention. Is this protest annoying or is it terrorism or whatever? Because then we can see that politicians and lobbyist groups can draw their attention and speak about the forms of protest that are comfortable for them, but not really talking about what is their responsibility, what we are asking them to do. It's a very complex situation that we are in, and as I said earlier, we never imagined to exist for now almost 6 years now as Fridays for Future worldwide. I think we always had in mind we're going to do 1 or 2 strikes reminding everyone that climate action needs to happen now and more faster and in a more in a just transition. But now here we are still reminding both, I think, the government and political parties, everyone, and not just one party. It's not the duty of, let's say, the Green Party to focus on climate action, but of everyone, because it's one of the most stressing issues of the 21st century. So it's an issue for everyone.
Now, if you like what you see and if we managed to make you laugh at least once, please support our work and go to patreon.com/Eurozine. This is the magazine presenting this show. You can pledge as little as €5 a month or whatever you can afford, and you'll get access to bonus materials, early access, and even get to suggest topics and questions. Thank you for your support, and now back to the program.
So we always come back to the idea of the bourgeois every day that shouldn't be upset by these external factors, but these are not external factors after all. But I think to be truthful to the problem, we have to turn it on its head, because I can very well agree that protest, when it's about vital issues, should be allowed to trespass the boundaries of sort of everyday courtesy. But what if this protest is not for the causes that I like? What if this is vigilantism from the far right, of which we see more and more?
A couple of decades ago, we had protests by something called the Countryside Alliance, which was against the then Labour government, from people from the countryside who felt that the Labour government was encroaching on their rights, including the right to hunt animals. This was not particularly, it was not particularly popular with liberals, but if you're a supporter of protest, then of course that kind of protest has to go ahead. Where it becomes much more difficult, of course, is when you have extreme right protests against asylum seekers, for instance, which always has a risk of turning violent, but may not turn violent. And again, I think you have to be very careful about recognising that people have the right to protest even about things that you find extremely distasteful. We sometimes make the mistake on the centre ground of politics or on the liberal side of politics that the politics of the street is always a good thing. And I think it's quite important to remember that it isn't always a good thing. There are plenty of examples in history when politics enters the street, that is actually a sign that the democratic process is breaking down. We can all approve of protest. We can all recognise that going onto the streets to express our dissent is important. But this is a complex matter, and sometimes when politics enters the street, it's not to the common good.
I agree that the violence in the streets or violent protests is an indicator that the social contract has come to some sort of disruption. But in Euromaidan in 2013, the state started the violence, and then people fought back. And then the state started to shoot people in the street in Ukraine, in Kyiv. The social contract was broken, and it was necessary to stay the ground until something changes and disrupt everything around it, because no democratic process could exist when police beats up students. What's the goal of far-right extremist violence? When people protest in anti-racist riots, they want proper treatment, right? They want to address white supremacy. They want something, they do not want to hurt anyone. They want normal attitude to themselves. When far-right protests or extreme far-right violence, what is their goal? Their goal is to force people out of their homes. I don't think forcing people out of their homes should be given, street legitimacy. Because it's wrong to force people out of their home, I don't know.
I know this is a very weird thing to bring in here, but I do live in a country where a good portion of the population and the entire government thinks that Ukrainians fighting back against the Russian invasion is a misguided point, and that they should have preserved themselves, as in you guys, Ukrainians, should have preserved yourselves by just giving things up, because there would be less destruction.
People under Russian occupation in Ukraine live so well. They're getting tortured, raped, killed. It's like a miracle. I don't know. like it's never a good idea to accept the imperialist violence. I mean, and even to Emma's point of the fact that protests should be uncomfortable and they should draw attention, and people should pay attention to what protesters are saying with Russian aggression in Ukraine. If Ukrainians had accepted Russian occupation, there would be no concept of Ukrainians in 50 years, I think. And I have very, very good reason to think so. On the walls of some occupied and recently deoccupied houses in Kharkiv Oblast, Russian soldiers wrote phrases like, "It's not a war crime if you had fun." So I'm not sure what peaceful resolution in giving up can be considered. They don't think Ukraine can exist.
If we accept what you say, Jana, which on so many levels we should, but if we go with your point that we should judge the tools of a form of protest or resistance by its goal, then shouldn't we feel heartbroken for all the oil barons that Emma's protests are shortening of wealth?
Well, I'm very sorry for everyone that is suffering from not being able to finance their next private island.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're gonna work on finding another place for them where they can be happy at.
The founding conflict of the Soviet Union, and consequently a lot of consecutive movements and discourse, is between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. We always come back to this: are we allowed to use violence towards our righteous means? And, well, I don't know if you're informed, guys, but the Bolsheviks kind of killed the Mensheviks, so they took this one and then instated a reign of terror that very few of them even thought before that this would be the rule of the day. So I feel like this is always this historical discourse revolving around how far we can go. What do you think, Martin?
As you say, we are talking from Warsaw, where there are several historical examples of the importance of resistance. I've just been at the Warsaw Uprising Museum, where there was, of course, a failed uprising against the Nazi occupation here. At the same time, we're present where in a country which was the first to resist Soviet occupation, and there were all sorts of forms of protest. There were the most amazingly kind of imaginative forms of protest where people would mingle with the secret police, disguised as secret police in Poland. So, you have to salute the human imagination in finding different ways of resisting. But of course, you can never know. Those are two examples where in one case it turned out for the best, and in one case it turned out for the worst. You can never know where protest will lead. We celebrate 1989 for the demonstrations, and I happened to be there at the protests in Leipzig, the most wonderful celebratory moment. At the same time there were demonstrations in China which ended up being crushed. These are the two models of protest that we have. We have the example in Ukraine, the inspiring example of Euromaidan, and then the terrible example of the Russian invasion. I think that the difficulty is that we often look at protests from the reverse historical lens, and so we draw conclusions because of its success or its failure. And in fact, we have to believe there's a human desire to resist authoritarianism, to resist the crushing of the human spirit. And although we're in the most terrible moment, I can't imagine what it's like to be in Ukraine right now, or to be a Uyghur Muslim in China. But we must surely retain that spirit of resistance, whatever the result.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you say, that we tend to judge resistance from the end result, as if that were the only thing that mattered. And just bringing this up, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was drowned in blood, and I wouldn't put that down as a historical moment that wasn't, in a very weird way, it just wasn't worth it. It was a very genuine choice to die if they had to die somehow a bit more meaningfully. It's a terrible choice, but at least it's a choice. And I think what we oftentimes tend to forget is that these define our political cultures.
It's really important not to allow what Jana's referred to as the imperial powers to rewrite the meaning of those moments. As I understand it, that's precisely what Russia has done about Maidan, is that they rewrite the history of this moment as being it was not real demonstration. It was America that was behind it. That it was not genuine. It was not a genuine protest. And it's that kind of rewriting of history that's really important to fight against, I think.
A lot of people do believe in American-baked coup, and it's always kind of funny to me. Russia does it a lot, not only to Ukraine, and we continue to maintain Ukrainian identity and culture, and resisting Russian aggression, not because we want to make sure that, not because we want to counter Russian narrative, but because if we don't, we die. I don't remember, you said that Euromaidan was a good example of protest and Russian aggression was bad. Russian aggression was a response to its colony being out of hands because of Euromaidan.
They could have accepted that Ukraine is another country and does what Ukraine decides to do.
Yeah.
There was a sort of mathematical option on the table.
They could have, right? Wouldn't that be so nice of them? I do think that it's contrary to imperialistic nature to accept such things, but they could just. Why aren't empires nice? Sorry.
I guess then they cease to be empires, and that's the nicest part I can imagine.
If you want to know more about the protests in Poland, we have two Agatas for you, Agata Areszkiewicz and Czarnacka, in the journal Esprit, or in Eurzine in an English translation. Link is in the description, along with our other sources, because we don't just invent histories here. You find reading lists with every episode at eurzine.com/standardtime. And now, back to the conversation.
Emma, you mentioned that you hadn't expected for Fridays for Future to exist so long. Unfortunately, in my experience, these fights tend to be much longer than you and I, bare feet, are well equipped for or would comfortably be engaging in. How do you see Fridays for Future's course now? And do you think that this turns from a protest movement into anything else? Or do you think that it needs to insist on being a protest movement specifically?
I'd say some of us started to get to be like lobbyists as well, to talk with politicians about certain laws, what we agree on and what we propose as legislations. But we also are on the street as well because we see it's necessary. Without us, there's still too little progress. We are kind of the alarm that is always there in the morning, reminding everyone that they need to wake up and they need to still act on more laws that are that we need to address. But I think right now it's we in Austria especially, and in other countries like Germany, we see that we also need to evolve. Also regarding the rise of the far right, we helped to organize the demonstrations in January. I'm sure you saw the pictures and the videos of the demonstrations against the far right in Germany, and we also organized some in Austria as well, now before the election 2 weeks ago, because it's very clear that the fight for democracy and the fight for climate action are, well, they're so intertwined and so necessary for each other that it's very clear for us to not only focus on climate action, but to always connect it to other issues, to other topics that are, well, because we see the climate action is the basis of all of it, and we need to connect it that also people understand it better, what is our concern and what it's actually about.
So ultimately, as much as I understand, you are gearing up for a very long march. Martin, can we condescend a little with the young discussants and think about whether protest is just an age or a phase, or people grow out of it? There's this very condescending conservative line often attributed to one of your very popular prime ministers, that you should be a rebel in your 20s and then sort of cool down. Do you think that's fair, or is that just spoken from a position of power?
It isn't always just young people that are on the streets, of course. But I think, one thing that struck me from this discussion and thinking about these various revolutions and their significance is that we do need to look at the historic significance of those big 20th century revolutions, and as they drifted into the 21st century, because it may sound like I'm contradicting myself, but it doesn't matter when these things work and when they don't work. And what I mean is that we know that one of the reasons that Putin is doing what he's doing is that he was living in Berlin at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he was appalled by what he saw. And so we know that oppressive regimes look at what happened across Eastern Europe with horror. That the idea that people can go onto the streets and genuinely make a difference, they can genuinely transform countries, they can bring about democracy, they can engender a spirit of social democracy or freedom. This is terrifying to the likes of Putin. Whether we look at what happened in Ukraine, or we look at what happened in the Arab Spring, whether we look at what happened in China or Hong Kong, we do need to recognize that oppressive imperial regimes have learnt from those revolutions. They have learnt what happens if you don't crack down. And that is, I think, what we need to be most wary of, is that they know they can crack down, they know that they can stop these revolutions, and they're terrified of what happens if we allow people to fulfill their desire for freedom.
So should we also learn something from these examples? Or give me some homework.
give you some hope, maybe. We may not have found the best way to express our desire for freedom, but you've got to hope that it doesn't always end in war. I was very struck, in fact, by the young Germans that I spoke to recently in Hamburg, who were very resistant to the conventional view of how to stop fascism. So the conventional view, according to them, is the only way to stop fascism is war. The only way that we stopped the Nazis was by carpet bombing Dresden. The only way that we stopped the Japanese was to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And their view was that this was mistaken. There was resistance to the Nazis, that students did resist the Nazis, and that if we study the way that authoritarian regimes are resisted, we can maybe think of different ways of stopping aggression than war.
People who participate in protests should learn first aid and wear comfortable sneakers and study where they protest before they go there, and study where to run away if things get heavy, and get a buddy or two. And the phones are kind of, on one hand, they can help you orient yourself, and on another, they can give to people you don't want to give your data.
You also publish in English on Guara Media.
A little,
so
yeah.
People should seek this out to see your ideas firsthand. If people understand and empathize with what you've just told us, how could they meaningfully show support in the framework of either protest or whatever kind of support?
So if you're someone who live in a country who can give military aid to Ukraine, then you can call your representative and ask them to stop giving it to Israel and give it to Ukraine instead, because we don't do what Israel does, and we really do need it to protect ourselves. Donate if you can. If you don't want to donate like Ukrainian military, fine. Donate to Ukrainian charities.
Thank you.
We want to know, when was the last time you were on the street protesting or throwing soup on paintings? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're already rummaging down there, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. This talk show is presented by Eurozine, and if you haven't heard of it, you should check it out right now, because this online magazine trades in a scarcity item, and that's insight. Eurozine publishes thoughtful long-form articles from more than 100 partner journals across dozens of European languages, and you have access to all of it for free. Display Europe is the force behind this project. It is one of the only content sharing platforms that offers you articles, podcasts, and videos about European politics and culture in 15 different languages. And yes, they don't even abuse your user data. I know, it's unbelievable. Go check it out at displayeurope.eu. This program is co-funded by the Creative Europe program of the European Union and the European Cultural Foundation. Importantly, the views and opinions expressed here are those of the speakers and authors only, and they do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or the European Education and Culture Executive Agency. Neither the European Union nor the EACAA can be held responsible for them. Not that we would mind them taking advice from us, though.